and then as a technologist. I was the founder of a company that specialised in feeding control for salmonids, and so I've had a long history of how to feed fish and shrimp in aquaculture successfully. I had 7 years running a company that led the world in scientific fisheries acoustic software. We had always thought that there's got to be a solution to feeding in shrimp. And we thought if we could combine our knowledge from feeding in salmon with high-level acoustics, that perhaps there would be a chance of feeding shrimp successfully. All right. I really look at an industry like the shrimp industry, and I think there's incredible opportunity for industrialization. I watched the salmon industry industrialize, and I watched the incredible benefits that came from that. So then you say, where is shrimp on the industrialization scale compared to salmon, bass, bream, tuna, kingfish? And so some of the key indicators of the level of industrialization will be the genetics, the feeds, the production systems, and the economies of scale. So you can see with salmon, it is ticks everywhere. It's all green. Same with sea bass and bream. This is snapper. This will be red sea bream in Japan. Great genetics, good feeds, old style production system, mum and dad farmers. Kingfish, they've just started the genetics, and so companies like Nisui in Japan have mastered the genetics of some of the cereolas, and the impact on the industry from that is incredible. Great feeds, production systems that are sometimes very small, but now there are some very big Japanese companies working like Maruha, Nisui, Mitsubishi, Nichire, some really big ones. And then you go down to bluefin tuna, there's no genetics. The feeds are just moist feeds. The production systems are quite good at a holding capacity, but quite poor when it comes to feeding. No economies of scale. Shrimp, a lot of work is done on genetics. I think capturing the benefit and exploiting the benefit presents a challenge for the genetics companies. Feeds, big opportunity to go further. There's great advancement in feeds, but there's big opportunities, and this is the area I'll focus on. And then it's production systems, and then when it comes to economies of scale, well, you've got huge players, medium-sized players, and an awful lot of mum and dad players, especially in Southeast Asia, India and China. So I'm going to look at the salmon industry and look at the industrialization of feeds and feeding. What I saw happen in the salmon industry over a 10, 15-year period, I'm now seeing happening in the shrimp industry. And so the shrimp industry is going to industrialize just like the salmon industry did. So if you look at the evolution of salmon feeds, they started with moist feeds, so raw fish. Then they had wet pellets. Then they had steamed pressed pellets. Then they had extruded pellets. Now through that process, you've had food conversion reduced from 7 to 1.1. The feed cost per kilogram has reduced by 70%. The labour cost to feed the fish has reduced by 80%. And now they can have feeds where there is no animal meal at all, if they wanted to. And the level of substitution, soybean, lupin meal, others, is incredibly high. Now, all the benefits that came from the salmon industry have passed across to other areas, like the kingfish, bass, bream, snapper. But it really was the salmon industry that led the industrialization of fish cage culture. So if you look at the evolution of feeding methods in the salmon industry, they started hand feeding, they went to cannon feeders, they went to individual automatic feeders, and now they use centralized feeding systems. If you're going to build a salmon farm, you design it to have the right feeding system from the start. You would never build a salmon farm unless you have industrialized feeding systems. One of the issues that they had in the evolution of feeding systems in salmon is that even if you stood on the surface of the cage, you could only see 3% of the cage. You were reliant on a surface response of the fish. The cage might be 30 meters deep, but you can only see what's happening on the surface, and you can't tell whether you're feeding too fast, you're feeding too slow, you're wasting feed. Is impossible. And then you have all of the factors that influence feeding and how much they'll eat per day. Temperature, oxygen, moon phase, predators, just the water quality itself, current flows. And what this means is that every day the amount of food the salmon needs alters. And so you can't just preset how much food you're going to give the cage and hope it's correct. It's impossible. Absolutely impossible. And so here's the whole feeding behaviour of salmon from 70 grams through to a harvest fish of 4 kilograms. Salmon are visual feeders, so they only eat during the day. And you can see this is summer, winter, and then summer. So when they're small, they may eat 12 times a day. In the middle of winter, they'll probably have 2 meals a day. Now what you see here, this is where a hierarchy is formed in the cage, where the dominant fish are hogging the feeding resource. And so you have the dominant fish eating first, then you have the subdominant and subordinate fish eating second. And then they have a small meal in the evening. By the time they're ready to harvest, they're really only having one really big meal at the end. And so you can see the incredible variability through the season, through size, day to day that there is. So there was an opportunity for feeding control. The feeding control systems that AQ1 built were based on infrared sensors being placed halfway in the cage. We monitored the food that wasn't eaten, and we had a closed-loop feeding system with behavioural-based control algorithms, which meant that we could feed the fish to appetite with zero waste. When you do that, you get incredible efficiencies. The industry grew too big for our system. The cages got so big. Right now, you can have 1,000 tonne of fish in one cage. And that's going to eat 20 tonnes a day, one cage. Incredible amounts of feed. So feeding cameras have really become the primary control mechanism. And we now have this to the point where one of the farmers in Tasmania, where I live, has their control room in Hobart, and they have farms all over Tasmania, the furthest about 300 kilometres away. They control feeding from the office in Hobart for cages on the other side of the island. This is just common. This is standard practice. And so what's the benefits of adding feeding control? So you've got industrial delivery systems, and now you've got control. We did some research when we took our technology to Norway, and these were the results of 50 farms with AQ1, the blue compared to the industry average. What you saw is the really bad food conversion rates disappeared and some incredible conversion rates happened. I mean, we had one farm that did a food conversion of 0.85 to 1. So it grew more than the feed that it was given. You also had growth increases. And when you apply this to some of the big cages, that food saving is worth $77,000 per crop in one cage. So feeding control just became standard. It's standard all across salmon. One of the developments that happened in the salmon industry was when they moved to the centralised feeding systems that blow food along pipes up to 800 metres at 20 metres a second, there was a lot of breakage in the food. And so the industry standard now in salmon is that after the food comes out into the cage, there has to be less than 1% breakage or dust that comes out the pipe 800 metres away. So the need to get your physical characteristics of the feed correct is super important. They even developed special hardness testers. So the company that I worked for developed a way to help feed companies to produce the right hardness of the feed so that it came out the pipe and into the salmon cage without breakage and dust. When that doesn't happen, when the feed manufacturer has a problem, then the farmer says that's not good enough, he'll give the feedback, and in an extreme case, where they don't meet this incredibly high standard, they go to court. And so there was a farmer in Tasmania that grows about 40,000 tonnes a year, and the feed supplied broke in the pipes, and so they ended up in court. So the demands on the feed companies to produce feed that's perfect for feeding systems is extremely high in salmon. These feeding control systems also enabled the farmers to compare feeds, because now you had a way where you could feed the fish ad libitum, without waste, guaranteed, and so now the true performance of the feeds came out. That enabled the farmers to negotiate prices for feeds that were appropriate to their performance. This is a bass and bream farm. I think it's Culmarex in southern Spain. We did some research here. We really wanted to look at the impact of waste feed and good feeding performance has on the environment. It was done with 2 universities. And so any waste that goes out, for every tonne of fish grown, you get about 200 to 400 kilograms of solid waste. It ends up under the cages. The benthos starts beautiful. It gets to the point where there's a lot of food for the benthic communities, and then the fish that come along and eat them, but then it goes sour. This is a disaster for fish farms, and it's why they rotate their cages around, just like fallowing a paddock if you were growing crops. The impact of this is, when you applied feeding control technology, a 15% reduction in food conversion rate produced a 23% decrease in the carbon in the sediment, which is a major indicator of the status of the sediment. So huge potential there. So now we come to shrimp farming. That's salmon farming. You've seen the value, you've seen the trends, you've seen the development. In shrimp farming, the need for feeding control is more acute. In salmon farming, the waste food goes out of the bottom of the cage and can get carried away by currents. They can change the position of their cage so that the benthos recovers. That's all possible. In shrimp farming, well, if you have waste feed, if you feed inefficiently, you're going to have leaching, underfeed cannibalism, so low survivals. Feed is a fantastic sort of substrate for the proliferation of bacteria. The pond chemistry changes, and then it all leads to poor production performance. So the value of providing high quality feeds that are delivered precisely 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is super important. Here's the feeding in shrimp. hand feeding, cannon feeding, automatic feeders, feed trays, same as salmon. We all know how much feed is as a percentage of the cost of production. It's a huge amount of the cost of production. This is the production cost split from Thailand from super intensive ponds. But the reality is that 90% of shrimp production cost is directly related to feeding effectively. So we started to investigate. There were some really good scientific papers out there from the wild fisheries sector that said shrimp made a sound when they feed. And so we took that information and we tried to develop a system where we could feed ad libitum all the food the shrimp wanted and not have waste. And so we created a feeding system that uses a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone. You connect it to aerators, so you can optimize power usage. You can add environmental probes, and you can control the whole thing from an office in New York. I mean, I could sit here right now and I could dial in to Saudi Arabia and watch the shrimp feed every second live. That's the level it's sort of got to now, the technology. What does it look like? There's a controller on the pond. The hydrophone is about the size of my finger. Even if it gets fouled, it doesn't matter, it can still hear, which makes it probably one of the best feeding control sensors in aquaculture. It's fantastic, easy to clean, and doesn't require daily cleaning, which is really great. So the early research, we focused on the relationship between the sound of the shrimp and how much they ate. And what we found is that the correlation was super strong. We put feed trays in to just check that what we were seeing was correct. And then this is how it presents to the customer in our software. So what you have the blue, which is kilograms per hectare, and red is the feeding response of the shrimp. And so what you're really getting is a constant matching of food delivery to shrimp appetite. This is the detail behind that graph. The red is the sound the shrimp make when they feed, and the blue is really how fast we're feeding. So you can see the feeding system matches the shrimp feeding response. Really important. Every hour we check that there's no food left. If you check during the middle of the hour, there will be a little food there, but at the end there won't be any food left. So you've now got precise feeding 24 hours a day. This is a classic winter feeding period where oxygen's low here, they don't want to feed, it's cold, and then the temperature goes up and they all start feeding really heavily. There's summer patterns, there's winter patterns, there's moon phase patterns. It's never the same. It's never the same day to day, ever. The idea is that at the end of the crop, there is zero waste and your animals have been fed everything they want. You have environmental controls. So if you chose not to feed the shrimp at high temperature or low oxygen, you can do that. Or you can feed them a maintenance ration, which you might do at super high temperatures. The work we've done in Saudi Arabia, where there's the highest temperatures for shrimp farming in the globe, indicates to us you should push the feeding in high oxygen. Don't worry about the temperature. Do not worry about the temperature. In Honduras, I've seen temperatures up to about 34, 35 degrees. That doesn't worry me. Feed them, because that's the best oxygen and you'll get a better end result combination of growth and food conversion. So you can see here, this is Saudi Arabia, where they didn't feed during low oxygen and didn't feed due high temperature, and they only fed when the environmental conditions were great. This was actually really bad settings because in the end, there was so much low DO and so much high temperature that you only fed 10 hours a day. And really, you've got to feed more than that. And so now in the system, you're able to see the oxygen profile from your farm. So, excuse me, the red pond here is a pond that has super low oxygen. And then you can click on the pond and you can see what's happening there. You can suspend feeding. You can get your guys out there. You can increase your water exchange to the pond. You can start making decisions to make sure you don't have an issue. It's really important for us that the systems work 100% of the time. And so our system has an operations report. It does a couple of things. This is how much time it was feeding with the acoustics, or on timer, or the system was off, or paused by the user. So we know exactly, as a manager, you know exactly what the people on the farm are doing with the system. Down here are the events our system records. So the red, I know someone's gone to the controller on the pond and pressed the button to see if all the feeders are working. So I can tell if the guy who's given the job of managing the system is doing his job properly. I know if I've got a power issue, that's the blue. I know if the feeders are empty or blocked. And so I can really home in on exactly what's happening at ground level on my farm. With feeders, the really important thing with feeders is output rate and spread and reliability. It's a really tough marine environment, and if systems aren't engineered to the level required, they will fall apart very quickly. This is all the feeders on the pond and which feeders have problems, which feeders have warnings, and all the feeders that are working fine. So now you know everything your feeder's doing. It's got complete diagnostics in the feeder, and you're able to see the situation with your feeders. If you have feeders that are poor quality, you end up with a feeder graveyard. In salmon farming, I've seen huge feeder graveyards as they moved from cheap feeders that aren't built for the environment, low capacity, to highly engineered feeders that cost more, but they don't cost more. In the long run, they don't cost more, they cost less because they're reliable and they last longer. But I used to see feeder graveyards all over the salmon industry all the time. And so the results that we've got from around the world, we did a survey in 2017. And so the sort of farming that's done in Honduras, Nicaragua, Ecuador particularly, these are the results we got from our farms from adding feeding control with automatic feeding. So really, really significant results. This was like Japan, New Caledonia, Saudi Arabia, and the intensive ponds was really Southeast Asia. So it doesn't matter how you farm, the value of feeding control is super important. And so like some of the setups, super intensive in Vietnam, Saudi. This is Auburn University, so we heard from Alan Davis 2 days ago. That's the farm set up there. Intensive farm in Venezuela, and then this is Nat Teresa in Ecuador. Now, it's my company, we're a business, and so I can put all sorts of things forward that say our system works fantastic, we get great results. But it's really important for us that we get independent corroboration of the results. And so this was an early trial that we did with Sasat University in Thailand. Now, Sasat University is the leading shrimp university in Thailand. And so we compared hand feeding 4 times a day with timer feeding against our acoustic control system. And so these were the results. You can see timer feeding produces a substantial benefit. Once you add feeding control, you go to another level of benefit. The water quality parameters, well, hand feeding where the food sits there for a long time, there's an awful lot of leaching into the environment, a lot. Where timer feeding, And feeding control is quite good, substantially better. This was the Auburn University setup that Alan Davis spoke about on Wednesday. Some of the results that he got, really, this is income. So this is revenue from the shrimp less feed cost. And so you can see by adding feeding control above timer, the profit outcome is really high. In Honduras, I think Nicaragua, we have around about 10 or 12 farmers using the system, but the first farmer to adopt the system across farms totally has run his first crops. And so this is 2018, that's 2017 on this farm, 2018 without feeding control and with feeding control, and you can see the growth rate is 0.3 higher per week. The food conversion is 0.6 lower. There was a benefit in survival. You don't always get a benefit in survival, not always, but generally you do. And this is some data from a farm in Nicaragua. Cargill have developed some new feeds, some fast feeding feeds. And this is just beautiful feeding. You can see that they're feeding slow earlier in the morning. You can see a major surge in the afternoon. They come off the feed, then they have another surge of feeding, and by 10 o'clock in the evening, they're almost not feeding at all. And so the idea of the system is to continuously adjust to the feeding appetite and check on a regular basis that no food is wasted. That's the concept. The impact of feeder configurations in shrimp. When we first came, we did all our research in intensive ponds, 1 hectare, monodon, Vaname in Australia and Southeast Asia. And so we came to Ecuador and we got given a pond that was 1 kilometre long and about 150 metres wide. And I said to the farmer, I don't know how to do this. We don't know how to position the feeders. We don't know what the shrimp are going to do. But over time, over the last 4 years, it's become evident how to configure a system. And so there's a few rules that we really like when it comes to how to lay out a system. Normally 5 to 6 tonne of biomass per feeder, 10 to 12 kilograms of shrimp per square metre of feeding area. But both of these depend really heavily on the feeding speed of the shrimp. And this is the key point from my talk today, the feeding speed of the shrimp. When it comes to the position of feeders, you want to put them in the best environmental conditions in the pond. And I'm seeing the Ecuadorians invest heavily now in aeration to go with our system. It's not to increase the oxygen levels of the pond. They do that through water exchange. But what they're doing is pushing currents through the feeding zone to keep high oxygen levels in the feeding zones where most of the shrimp are. So there's an additional significant benefit on top of it providing feeding control. If you can get some current movement going through, it's fantastic. I heard recently in Ecuador 3 weeks ago that there's a solar-powered current mover. I'm really looking forward to seeing this. I think that could have fantastic application in the ponds in Latin America. The impact of configuration, configuring it correctly. Now, this is a farm in the Middle East, so you have feeders, our control system, and they blow the food from a truck down pipes into the feeders. Those feeders have about 3 days capacity at maximum feeding rate. But we did a lot of experimentation about what's the best way to configure a system. Now, these guys have got aeration. But when we were forced to start with 4 feeders, which meant we had 12 tonne of shrimp per feeder. When we moved to 8 feeders, so there's now 6 tonne of shrimp per feeder, You can see the growth went up significantly, but the FCR was the big winner. So it really reduced the food conversion rate. It spread the shrimp out. It reduced localized oxygen drops below feeders. And so that's massive. That is a massive difference. While I've been here, there's been a lot of talk about, low prices. Well, I'm no expert, but I listen to the expert, and it sounds like they're here to stay for a while. So this is the future. So the only choice is to improve your productivity. It's the future. And Asian competition. Can Latin America match Asia in the cost of production? There's some concerns about that. Now, my view is that if your oxygen levels are quite good, however you achieve that, you have a good nutritional package, the feeds are eaten rapidly, you have the right feeder configuration, then I know farmers in Latin America that are using our system that are producing 2.5 grams a week. In fact, one of them's in the audience. I won't name him, but he knows who he is. And he's producing an FCR of around about 1. That is totally competitive with anything I see in Southeast Asia. So I think there's a really big future here for the Latin American farmers to be able to compete and perhaps beat a lot of the farmers in Southeast Asia on cost of production. And if you look at the structure of the industry in Southeast Asia and India and China, there's a lot of mum and dad growers that won't embrace technology for whatever reason. They're very slow to embrace it. And I think that it's this sector that's going to shrink as production goes up and production costs come down. That's my guess is what's going to happen. But I guess disease plays a huge part in prices. So I think it's a pretty dynamic space, and who knows where it's going to end up. So now we need the need for feeding control. Same as salmon. All the factors, weather, oxygen, temperature, water quality, moon phase, it's the same. There's so many factors that influence how much the shrimp want to eat, you can't predict it. Here's some data. So the red line is maximum temperature, and you can see quite clearly through our system, huge temperature drop, big drop in appetite, goes up again as temperature rises, and it follows the temperature curve very heavily. This is data from a super intensive facility in Thailand. The top graph is, you can see temperature's nice, oxygen's good. Temperature's dropped here a few days later, and the oxygen's gone down. This is the same time period, and so you can see how fast they feed. So they're eating about twice as fast, just because of 4 degrees and 1.1 milligram per litre lower. The other important thing from this graph, it's really important. In Southeast Asia, they've been using automatic feeders for 10 to 15 years. They've developed feeds that work really well with automatic feeders. They've got the size and the hardness right so that the shrimp eats super fast. And so you just look at how fast they're feeding. That's the fastest feeding food in the world. That's CP food. Fantastic food. It's not extruded, and I've seen it in head-to-head trials with the best extruded feed from Latin America, and they're equivalent. So you've got a pelleted food that is equal to the best extruded food in Latin America. The effects of molting. So you've got, this is 3 ponds on the same farm, and there was a synchronous molt across 3 ponds. So they're feeding quite heavily, drops right off, and then comes up. So another factor that affects feeding. You can see disease coming. When you do ad libitum feeding, you can see disease coming. I'm not sure if you can stop it, but you'll start to see it coming. And perhaps there's some things you can do with your husbandry to minimize the effect of the disease, because you get some early warning that's happening. So how will feed companies and feeding technology suppliers work together in shrimp farming? just like they did in salmon farming. How are they going to do it? Well, the reality is feeding once or twice a day with large water-stable feed doesn't work with automatic feeders. Well, it does, but it doesn't produce the best results. In fact, it really compromises results very severely. So it's all about the physical characteristics of the feed: size, hardness, crunch, shape. And there's a lot of research opportunity here. So the enemies in physical characteristics, these are the enemies. Well, dust. We all know why dust is not good. That's obvious. Chunks, lumps, whatever you want to call them, coagulates. They'll block feeders. They probably won't be eaten. Sticky feed, I've seen in Ecuador, like in that huge wet season they had 2 years ago. There's quite a soft feed that's made there. And then the feed started to clump because of the humidity in the feeders. So there's a bit of a challenge in softness. Hardness. If you've ever seen a shrimp feed, and unfortunately we've watched so many videos of shrimp feed at 1,000 frames per second, we start to understand how these guys are feeding. And so hardness and size are really, really important to getting fast feeding speed. So here's some work we did. I'm not sure, this might have been done in Asia. So you've got, 5-gram shrimp eating large grower pellets. We switched to a smaller pellet. Bang. Look at the increase in how much they eat. Incredible. If you want to look inside our sound feeding system, what does this look like? Yeah. What does it look like? That's 8 feeds an hour. Look at this, 26 feeds an hour. That's just by getting the feed right. The impact of that's incredible. So if you have big, hard, slow feed, what happens? You get increased competition. We don't want competition. We want animals that don't feel stressed. Stress is bad. Whether it's pigs, chickens, salmon, shrimp, stress is bad. Don't stress your animals. I know. You reduce the oxygen levels under the feeder because the shrimp collect there. The shrimp stay longer under the feeder because they're trying to get the feed. So the DO gets even worse. And then you get behavioural-based hierarchies that form in the shrimp, which means the dominant shrimp get all the feed, the subdominants get a bit of the feed, and the subordinates stay on the other side of the pond and don't grow. And so you can see hard feed underfeeding, and that's what you get. The solution to hard feeds, 2 solutions. One is you buy more feeders so you can spread the shrimp out. That's expensive for farmers. I don't want to see that happen because the solution's there. You need to make feed that's eaten quickly. Now, there's a variety of feeds all through Latin America that are eaten quickly. So these feeds exist, but there's a real transition from how you manufacture feeds now. This is some research we did with a customer in Saudi to look at how fast the shrimp ate. So in 1 or 2 days, we can tell you if your diet has improved the feeding speed of the shrimp. So if you can get the physical characteristics of the feed right, you can increase feeding speed by up to 250%. You can increase growth, improve food conversion, reduce labour, less capital cost. You need less feeders to feed the same biomass. And then you get better system uptime. So really, it's higher profits and reduced nutrient loading. It's a bit of a no-brainer. This is what's got to happen. So, it's an invitation from AQ1. We've worked with about 3 or 4 feed companies around the world to help them increase the feeding speed. And we're happy to work with any of them. It's very quick to make change here. And so, if you want us to come and help you in this area, we can come and help you. We do 1 or 2 day projects and we give you an answer. It's that quick. So if you're interested as a feed manufacturer, I'm available to talk, and so is my colleague Marcos Villarreal over here. All right, thank you.